It's great to be part of this discussion, and as Tom suggested, you're going to get a kind of hybrid perspective from me to try to fit in between the two distinguished professors on either side of me in the programme, and to reflect the evidence and the perspective. And I think, I hope, but I'm increasingly confident that the broad assumptions and some of the priorities, but conclusions about the research evidence and long-term priorities that might emerge in the discussion are consistent. But what I want to try and do is present some of that broader picture, use data to paint a picture and tell a story about what might be going on, but also use that hybrid perspective to frame what the challenges are for government and particularly for the whole community in Victoria, and then think about where the points of leverage or the kind of hard edges of challenge for policy and strategy might be, given the cumulative picture that begins to emerge out of the evidence. And so this is part of the framing that I suggest. Yes, there are many complex interactions and many diffuse effects, but if we're talking about social mobility as the chances of progressing from one generation to another and the various factors that go into that, the complex production and reproduction of life chances and life outcomes over the life course, then we're looking at a set of interactions between family, place and wealth and resources. And obviously, as Deb has already kind of begun to lay out, we're talking about the roles of work and learning through those interactions in influencing and mediating who gets what and what your chances are. That, I think, and I'll come back to it, leads to a clear thematic focus on jobs, on housing, crucially, and on education in the broadest sense. But of course, there are lots of other vital policy areas too, and how it all joins up, how you can get a broad long-term perspective while still getting edge and bite and delivery into what government does with these policy priorities, I think is the crucial practical challenge for government. So the long-term picture is entirely consistent with what Deb said, and I'll canter kind of quite rapidly over some of these slides, and I'm happy to share these slides later if you want to take a closer look. All the ones that I'll use are kind of come onto a mix of Australian level data and Victorian data, but for the Australian picture you can assume that the trend or the distribution is broadly the same for Victoria. So this shows over a century the long-term fall in communications and transport costs, the impact of technological change on globalisation, which leads to some of that intensification of trade, greater movement of people. Here's an illustration of the number of foreign-born people in different countries, including Australia. The things that are kind of acting in a macro sense over 40, 50, 100 years on the composition of our population and the structure and composition of our economy, leading into the kind of mix that Tom described in his introduction. That takes us to a set of employment projections and a recognition that actually our labour market and our economy are being kind of recomposed and restructured quite rapidly, even though Australia and Victoria have not been through the deep shock driven by the global financial crisis that several other advanced, or many other advanced economies have been through. And you can see in these projections, which I'm sure will be familiar to many of you, that the types of jobs where there'll be greater growth and expected to be greater demand are kind of twofold. Great increases in service-based jobs, especially health and social assistance, probably the greatest source of employment demand and potentially employment opportunity in Victoria over the next 10 or 20 years, alongside a whole set of science, technical, public administration and technology-driven jobs. And that creates both an interesting kind of overlapping set of questions on opportunities about who's going to get which job opportunities and what kind of life course it's going to put them onto. Then you can think about the role of education and educational progress in setting up different people, different groups of people for those economic opportunities that are going to come through. These are data from ACARA for the different states, which show Year 12 completions by socioeconomic status. And you can see, as well as seeing that the ACT is something of an outlier in terms of high SES students, you can also see that Victoria does relatively well, and from 2009 to 13 has actually made quite a bit of progress in narrowing the gap in terms of low SES students participating and completing through to year 12. So that's encouraging progress. It's incremental year by year progress, but that would suggest that parts of our education system are contributing, perhaps in modest ways, to boosting positive opportunity and contributing to a fairer distribution. And you can see it again as the data from 2015 from the Australian Early Development Census, which looks for indicators of developmental vulnerability in 3, 4 and 5-year-olds, so school readiness and those very early formative influences, which shows that only about 20% of Victorian children are developmentally vulnerable or one or two domains. And of course, there are other jurisdictions in Australia where the risks are much greater. And it's not surprising that it's the Northern Territory and Queensland. So then you can look at higher education access and attainment. The orange bar is tertiary participation among 18 to 30-year-olds. The red bar is tertiary qualifications among 25 to 34-year-olds. And you can see that Victoria is relatively well educated among those cohorts, does relatively well when you look on a kind of interstate, interjurisdictional basis. That, I think, adds up to an overall position which is really not bad. And it reflects a whole different mix, a policy history from both sides of politics and different kind of eras of government. There's been decentralisation, there's been long-term investment, there's been long-term urban planning, there's been activist effort to broaden the industry base and respond to the economic crisis of the 1970s. There's been all kinds of things. Victoria's been a leader in, within Australia in developing early childhood policies and investments. There's a broad mix there, and Victoria has got a relatively high performing economy with relatively well paid jobs, a relatively diverse sector or industry base, a relatively strong framework of social assistance, and a relatively coherent set of kind of social and educational policy directions. But the kicker is that being relatively good is no guarantee of the future. And that the global environment and the set of underlying drivers and pressures that we've begun to hint at, which I'm going to canter through now, I think actually present grave threats to the distribution of life chances and to the prospects of social mobility, and actually to the existing quality of life and economic opportunity of the status quo across the Victorian community. So how do we begin to understand that? Well, we've got to understand that although there is a premium, there's a wage premium to education, and we know that kind of getting university degrees and tertiary level qualifications is really important, and on aggregate will add about $1 million to your lifetime earnings. Actually, the wage premiums are very different according to different sectors and also between genders. So there's a very important set of dynamics here about women's labour market participation, women's education, women's career structures, and women's ongoing very, very high formative influence over the capabilities and the trajectory of their children. And we've got to be able to think about it in a differentiated way. We've also got to take seriously Deb's point about skill-biased technological and labour market change. So this graph shows that over 40 years in Australia, the only category of employment that has consistently grown strongly is employment opportunities for the highest earning 20% of the labour market. So people with high levels of qualification going through elite institutions and winning places in professions and technical and scientific occupations have been doing better and better and can expect to do so in the global economy that we see forming around us. But the consequences and the penalties for people who are in the bottom two cohort groups are fairly obvious. And so we have to be concerned about the simultaneous effects of that changing distribution. And that's also evident in what's been happening more recently the kind of changing distribution of rewards between wages and profits. So that owning capital assets, means you get much higher rewards. And the global policy of quantitative easing, what's been happening with yields and interest rates and money supply over the last 10 years has also really reinforced that, which in turn, unfortunately, has reinforced the Australian and the Victorian housing bubble, which is a massive driver of immobility in Victorian society, as well as a rather large economic risk to us. So that's an illustration of what it's meant over that kind of decade period, that the people benefiting from labour market change and technological and broader economic change are the people who were already best off. That leads us on to the kind of consequences over the life course of what that does to the distribution of life chances. What this shows is fairly obviously and intuitively, and there are a couple of other illustrations of it, that the people whose children are most likely to reach minimum standards in those early tests of schooling and formal education in literacy and numeracy are the people in those higher skill-biased occupations. The people who are most likely, the children who are most likely to go to university are overwhelmingly the children whose parents have been to university. It kind of makes obvious sense, but what happens to the other cohorts, and as Deb said, the kind of size of the rungs between the ladders fundamentally affects what happens to social mobility and whether or not growing GDP and the increasing supply of education is benefiting everybody in the labour market. Here's another illustration of that people from the Curtin Economics Centre in Perth, people with no post-school qualifications are far less likely to be employed, far more likely to be inactive. And what we have to be concerned about is that the different groups of labour market participants basically get sorted and clustered into very different trajectories. So, social mobility is a story of multiple impacts, diffuse processes, individual choices, and definitely a reflection of skill and effort. And therefore, the question is partly whether or not inequality and the stickiness of the distribution is justifiable and reflects norms of fairness, as Deb said. But what we ought to be concerned about, if you want to take a whole of Victoria and a whole of government perspective on it, is that there are a number of factors which, in this broad mix, as you kind of travel from one decade to another and one generation to another, specific factors act as compounding and cumulative factors. So that if you get two or more indicators of developmental disadvantage, or if you're growing up, as Deb said, in a household with one or two disabled parents, actually the barriers are being multiplied very rapidly and then creating disproportionate cost for government and for the rest of society, as well as imposing harsh consequences on individuals. So how do we think about those systemic challenges? Well, we have to think about them in geographical terms. We have to understand how place impacts, and we also have to understand how economic and industrial structure, the shape of the labour market, does fundamentally influence and interact with the infrastructure of government, health and social services, schooling, community effort, and so on. And these maps, I'm not going to try and talk a lot in detail about these because I think Shelley will tell us more in the next presentation. But one of the points that I want to make is that when you look at that distribution of most disadvantaged across Melbourne, it's just a relatively easier frame to see, you can begin to see quite clearly that, so light blue is the most advantaged, and the red patches are ones where 20th century manufacturing industrial bases were until the 1970s, and that the process of transition and restructuring, the process of long-term development, and then the sets of life chances that are generated for children who are growing up in those areas are really hugely affected by that surrounding industrial structure and the kinds of labour market opportunities that might be generated there. If you look at educational disadvantage, you can see it in slightly different terms that actually, compared to other Australian jurisdictions, this is from the Curtin Institute again, there's a kind of a more medium distribution. There's lots in the middle, and there are a few extremes, although there are some very specific pockets of extreme educational disadvantage, and we can talk about them too. But what concerns me about the current sets of pressures and forces is that there's polarisation going on because of our diverse public-private mix in schooling and education, and because of the kind of multi-sector, selective and competitive forces that work in our education system. So students from the highest 25% of SES going to just randomly selected well-known high schools, Melbourne High, University High, vastly disproportionate. It's not that surprising, but it is still very important that places in top schools, even government schools and even non-selective schools, although several of those are academically selective, are funneling and narrowing by SES, whether or not that's their intention or part of their public mandate. And that is reproducing immobility and narrowing access to elite educational and labour market opportunities. And at the same time, sorry if this is hard to read, but the Victorian Ombudsman's reports on school expulsions, suggesting that there's 6,000 or 7,000 school-age students outside of schools because they're being, mysteriously dropped along the way when they have complex needs and are not achieving minimum standards, or have disruptive behaviour, which is another indicator of there being other problems in the family and the developmental environment. It's producing a distribution which looks like that. That's just a hand-drawn impression. It's not hard data, but if you correlate school attainment in Victorian government schools to SES, it looks like that. A gradient where SES influences the average outcome, a lot of flat in a band in the middle, and then dramatic spikes with wealth and complex disadvantage at either end of the spectrum. And then, as Deb also said, if you look at crime in Victoria, maybe half of crime comes from 6% of postcodes. And the overwhelming impacts of crime on quality of life and on life chances come from the way that crime destroys the life chances of people who become clients of the criminal justice system, especially if that happens before they turn aged 18. And this is one of the kind of aggregate outputs. If you try and look at how all those things fit together, there are various different ways that we could talk about it. But as I said, we've got to think about the interaction between jobs, housing, and wealth and resources. Very striking to me when I saw this. This is a map of who's completed Year 12, and it shows that in the inner city, people living in the inner cities, the census data, at least 82% of Victorians had completed Year 12 or equivalent. In the dark red areas, beyond outer metro, getting into regional, obviously there's more of Victoria than there is on this map, but the pattern still holds. More than half did not complete Year 12. And actually there's a simple logic which explains this, which is if you want to work in a knowledge economy job, you're most likely to be coming into central Melbourne to do it. Something like 90% of the knowledge sector jobs in the Victorian economy, I think, are being generated in the CBD or its immediate environs. If you don't have Year 12 qualifications, not only are you not going to get those jobs, but you can't afford to live anywhere near the centre of Melbourne. And so there's a kind of aggregate sorting effect, which is rapidly undermining social mobility and those objectives of fairness, but also having the effect of spatially and regionally sorting populations into concentrations of advantage and disadvantage, which are deeply unhelpful on every level. This is how I would try and summarise and crystallise those challenges for Victoria. 3 interlinked systemic challenges, all operating at the same time. The concentration of elites is actually a big problem for social mobility. It's interesting to think about it from a well-intentioned and elite government perspective, and a kind of cross-sector policy elite perspective. But I've got no doubt that hardening and deepening elite status and attaching more wealth and more reward to it is a real thing in Victoria at the moment. Second, probably the biggest and most important task for social mobility is how to find ways of extending and reproducing those pathways to middle class life outcomes and making sure that they're available to the broad mass of the population. And that's not only the ladders that Deb was talking about, although they are fundamentally important, and I'll mention a few specific issues about them. So it is about making sure that kids with the potential to do it can access those kinds of adult life opportunities. But it's also about recreating the jobs, the housing opportunities, and the distribution of quality of life across different communities. And another harsh fact is that Melbourne is now one of the most expensive cities to live in, and possibly one of the more expensive cities to create a job in, and that's a challenge to the future production of social mobility and those middle class life outcomes. The fact that it's slightly worse in Sydney should not be much consolation to us. And then finally, beating early disadvantage. I won't imagine what Shelley's going to say, but there's no doubt that for 10, 12, 18% of the Victorian population, the complex set of factors which combine to severely compromise the prospect of better life outcomes through the adult life course is still serious. Victoria's done some interesting and important and progressive joined up things over the last 20 years to create new program strategies and new forms of governance to tackle those things, but they're not close to really biting on the scale and depth of the problem. So we've got to think about governance strategies, governance architecture, long-term perspectives and trajectories for government, which are capable of influencing these broadly distributed systems. That's another way that I would try to kind of characterise and maybe crystallise what the challenge is. It's not about picking the right levers in isolation and making sure that different ministers pull them. It's about conceiving of the systems that reproduce these outcomes across cohorts or across regions in slightly different ways, and then somehow producing a combination of a joined up governance architecture, and the Victorian government has huge capabilities and powers in terms of legislation, regulation, investment, infrastructure, expertise, data, capability, and the capacity to influence cultural change in various ways. We've got to think very hard about that, while also recognising that the determinants of social mobility are actually largely distributed across systems that government doesn't directly control, and that we need to kind of understand and promote the positive factors in those various systems, which are economic and social in nature. So let's come back to three basic priorities: simple to describe, complex to achieve, and the relationships between jobs, housing and education, between wealth, place and family. This is how I would characterise clusters of policy priority and things that I'd hope to use to kind of suggest stimulus for the conversation. I'm happy to come back to them. And they're kind of roughly placed on the axis between where the different corners of the triangle actually intersect with each other. So for education and housing, we've got to try and find much more effective ways to ensure that the size of your mortgage doesn't determine the quality of the schooling and the early years services that you can access. We've got to think about how to make progress for all learners, how to make that a genuine policy priority across all schools and all sectors, and we've got to think about area-based governance and forms of collaboration, zoning, transparency and incentive, which help all that to happen. We've certainly got to focus even more intensively on early intervention, on the role of family and health services, on partnership with the community sector, and on those kind of broad culture factors. And I think that Deb's point about data coincides absolutely with this emphasis on personalised pathways and understanding how every individual Victorian kind of navigates. We've got to think about the big issues of transport, urban planning, market design and regulation. I do think we have to think about wage equity, the role of unions, the dispersal of wages across the wider economy. And fundamentally, we can't do any of it without the Victorian economy's capacity to generate employment demand and new types of job. So understanding the role of government and partnership with the other sectors in doing that, and then understanding how to design employment conditions that actually work with the grain of innovation and competitiveness in the contemporary economy is also a fundamental part of it. We've got to find ways of setting a course for government which can pursue these kinds of directions over 4, 8, 16 years and make them less subject to the kind of swings of the political cycle. And we've got to find ways of harnessing broader institutional alliance and support to kind of build legitimacy for these goals and then demonstrate how institutions working together can produce cumulative impact. And that's one reason why I choose to work at RMIT, because it's one of the Victorian institutions which manages to be kind of full spectrum education provider. It's tertiary, it's vocational, it can reach into technical and school level education, as well as higher education and postgraduate research, and produces kind of advanced contributions. And there are many great tertiary institutions in Victoria with the potential to collaborate across sectors in understanding these problems and designing pathways and kind of multi-agency strategies in a way that I don't think we're fully utilising. Probably if there's one most urgent question out of that still fairly broad range, I think it is about the transitions that Deb talked about from the mid-teens and secondary education into the mid-20s and your labour market life course. And the fact that we still have an education and a labour market system which is disproportionately orientated towards the 40% of highest academic attainers who are logically going to go through university, do undergraduate degrees, and then work out what to do from there. How to design high quality pathways which navigate the educational, the labour market, and the informal capabilities, culture and relationships that will support the next 40% on that distribution to make really positive transitions, I think will be a fantastic conversation to have. Thank you very much.